First of all, I'd like to say it's not really fair following James. He should not be a warm-up man, he should be the man that starts at the end. But he's really got me concerned because I looked at my watch when he was talking and realised I've got a tag with 2 Gs. So maybe I've been caught out too. Thanks for inviting me along here today. I really, first of all, would like to say I really think it's important to note that the UK government, by following the example of what Wales is doing today, is very laudable. So I welcome their support. The other thing we asked about before the break was security of handhelds. For the 28 people in here who are advertising their Bluetooth presence, it's a good idea to hide that. So this presentation contains flashing lights. So basically, I'm not here today to talk about hype or to say what I think is my opinion. I'm talking about stuff that's underpinned by fact, what happens in the real world. And there's been a lot of denial for a long time that cybercrime is actually something that's just a myth. I believe we're here today, and this is evidence for the fact it's actually a reality. More flashing lights. Now, there's a bit of history here. The greyed out picture at the top is my first presentation I gave in 1993 at Virus Bulletin in Amsterdam, and the gentleman with the yellow ring is a chap called Win Schwartzau. And Win presented the concept of CyberWar to a very doubting audience who thought the man had completely lost the plot. As we see today, he was obviously thinking about something way in the future that's beyond people's imaginations, and here we are with this problem that we face. So maybe cyberwar is a bit strong, but cyber conflict is something we have to recognise. We've got Mr. Morris to the bottom left there, who created the first really infamous worm that took hold on the internet. And the gentleman at the bottom is the chap that caught Kevin Mitnick. He's also the author of Takedown, which I would recommend anybody to read. And the book itself, The Cuckoo's Egg. Who has actually read The Cuckoo's Egg in this room? Okay. For the rest of you that haven't read it, go and get a copy, because this was written some 25 years ago, and what was stated in there then is still as true today. So please go and get a copy. Clifford Stoll, The Cuckoo's Egg. It's very interesting. So we come today to all of these things that we face. Fred Cohen was the person who first stated that computer viruses were actually possible. Ralph Berger helped the virus writers along quite a way by producing a book called Viruses, a High-Tech Disease, which actually helped you write viruses, including it got me into the interest in viruses. And I've realised today, actually, if James was a lady, I'd love him. I could live with him, and I could talk to him all the time about really boring things. Hacking, I've done a lot of hacking in my time for clients and on behalf of organisations I've worked for in shadier times. The world of Trojans, malware, security vulnerabilities, and the new persistent threats and evasion techniques which we're seeing today on the internet. Flashing lights. So basically, we have here a society, a socio-economic society, and the picture at the top is a gentleman called Postel, and he was the person who first raised concern in the Clinton administration about internet root servers, and this gentleman actually directed one into his own domain, which caused quite a furore at the time. But he was trying to prove the fact that we had this thing called the internet, which was becoming relied upon so very much by governments and businesses and the public. It was not secure. And personally, as a matter of interest, it's not really secure today. We have businesses and governments with problems leaking data. We're going to come to some really good, bad examples of data leakage that is exposing people today to their business, their asset, and above all, in one case, actually impacting the potential to affect real life. So let's look at the history where viruses came from. We have here a rough roadmap going from what I call the chaotic era of viruses, with GCHQ, first of all, acknowledging that viruses were a reality after saying they were a nuisance. We have Ralph Berger's book being published. We have MOD suffering infections, right up to the Chinese attacks on Google. And this is really a history of where viruses have come from and how we've got to where we are today. And there's a lot of stuff out there. Now, as James said, the early stuff was really interesting and it was nice and fun because it did things that entertained. And I have 5,000 viruses which I love to play with and do things with, but I never let them go anywhere. Please believe me, they're very secure. But one of my little puppies I have is here today. And it is my favourite virus. And it's called Casino. Now, Casino's a nice little virus because it's got some humour. What it does, it takes your fat, your allocation on the older DOS systems, places it into memory and then says, I have it in memory. And you can have it back, but you've got to play a game. You have to play with me. So let's play. So you've got to spin around, so you get £3, you get your disk back. You get 3 question marks, you get a phone number. And if you don't get any of those things, you'll see what happens. So we've been unlucky. We've got a question mark, a 0, and a £1. Okay. We have 4 credits left. Let's go again. Hey, we're getting lucky. £2 and a 0. We could win here. We could get our fat back. Oh, not so lucky. 2 credits. Maybe we're going to be really lucky this time. No. And he's not very polite because he says, ha ha, you arsehole. Say goodbye to your balls. Well, I'm sure this is actually considering the person who has been infected to be male, not female, but there again, I'll let you decide on that one. So that's an example of an early virus. And then we come up to the current state, and this is where we're really seeing the impetus take off. Everything now is subliminal, below the radar. And we're seeing AETs and APTs starting to appear. And these APTs and AETs, there's a bit of a misconception what they are. People think they're a label. They're not. They're a way of using technology with mind, technology and code to attack targets. And it's all about something that's been mixed into a pot to gain access. And I've done several uses of APTs and AETs. And how do I know they work? Well, I've proved it. I've circumvented external security perimeters of large financial organisations. I've gained access to internal systems. And I even, embarrassingly, on one test, gained access to some sensitive servers on the internet belonging to American government agencies residing on a third party. If you look that up on the internet, I don't want to mention it here, but if you look it up, you'll find there is a link towards a Radio 4 interview, which was caused quite a bit of a stir. The point I'd like to make is I never revealed where those servers were. I did notify what I'd found, and they were secured within 12 hours. And then we've got the they are back syndrome. Boot sector viruses were around a long, long time ago. You put a floppy disk in, accidentally booted onto that disk, and you took an infection onto your hard drive, and you had a problem. And they disappeared because, well, you know, we had things come along that changed. Windows NT was written in such a way it's very complicated to actually infect in its early incarnation. And it wasn't actually a case of Windows NT being well written, it was actually badly written. It was just difficult to engineer, but it could be engineered. But we're now seeing boot sector viruses back because of auto-load, auto-runs. You put a key in and it accidentally runs on the computer. And when James talked about his disk in the bush, that actually has happened in real time, where one organisation in London, near Heathrow, one morning, a lot of the workers going into the office found lots of USB keys around the place. And, oh, that's great. And they all had interesting things on, like, you know, love letter to Jane, all sorts of stuff that would get different people's emotions going. And that morning, in that premises, there were so many alerts coming up from what was happening, but each key had something different to offer. So the organisation was guaranteed to get something, and they did. It took around about 3.5 days to clean the mess up, just because they were invoked by users who had an inquisitive nature. And then we have the Science and Tech Committee. This is going back to 2006, 2007, where they were actually acknowledging the threats that we face today, the threats of DOS attacks. And I've got clients now who are under significant pressure because of their market share, their market sector, who suffer the possibility of regular DOS attacks. These things can cost money and take time. They're a reality of circumstance. Oops. And then we have the UK government falling victim to cyber attacks. the Zeus malware, and this was where they were admitting we have a problem. We've got this issue about crime. We're seeing the government, GCHQ, saying we have a problem in this country. We have a problem in the US. It's been acknowledged by governments. There is an issue out there. So we can't just put this to one side. And we've found all of these infections of viruses all over the place. And the interesting thing about the reports of cybercrime and infections, the people who are reporting it are the people who know. It's the ones we don't know where the problem really resides. And the second thing we have in here today is we are all talking to each other. We are all informed. We need to inform those outside of our group. We need to get this into the wider public, to talk to the public about their risk and their perception of security. We need to help grandmas and granddads, not necessarily young because they're pretty savvy, but in my opinion, it's the older generation who are really suffering. They can't use this thing called the internet because they're frightened of the resource. And then we have Mr. Osborne himself saying they've got these pre-planned attacks taking place. And again, this very much mirrors in, which without design I may add, into what's happening in London today. We're talking about something, we're on a unified platform talking about cybersecurity and what we need to do to fix it. So it's a very real thing we're doing here today. And then we have the internet. It's a global place for threats, commensurate risks and far-reaching. We had Estonia, where it was proven that the dependency on computer systems can be an Achilles heel of the organisations and the countries and the governments, where they can be targeted to take things offline. For instance, think about ATMs. ATM machines are networks. They have IP addresses. If they can be circumvented, they can be attacked, which was the case in Estonia. If you can't get your money out the bank, you have a problem. We had Titan Rain around 2007, where Chinese governments were attacking targets in the UK, in Germany, and in the US. And I would like to sort of hold my hands up to something here. I was the first person to ever publicly acknowledge that there was a threat of sponsored security attacks from China some years ago, which was actually overheard by a Chinese gentleman who attacked me in the foyer, quite verbosely, in front of a journalist who took every single word down. And the very next day I got a phone call and they said, "Have you seen the newspapers today?" And I just went, It was, but we talk about it today as if it's a common factor. We know China is at it, as well as other people. The Russian risk was seen as substantial to economic and research. That's probably still the same. The Chinese interest was seen as moderate. This report was out 18 months ago. I'd say now we have two substantials there. These are realities of our time. And we have the commercial interest of espionage. It's very high. Denial of service. Hacktivism. Who understands the concept of hacktivism in the room? Please raise your hand. Okay, we have a number of people. This is something where actually I'm a big fan of saving rhinos. Two interests in life, eCrime and rhinos, and the rest of it doesn't matter. So I'm just a shadow of myself. But we have this interest. So I like saving rhinos. So I decide anybody that destroys rhinos, if I want to be a hacktivist, I would take that cause out into the greater world to convert the great and washed into my way of thinking by denial of service attacks, attacking them in any way I possibly can. So I'm taking forward my motivation, not for money, but to drive a purpose, a statement. That's hacktivism. There's no money involved. Surreptitious malware. And a question I would ask, actually, we call these things smartphones. Why are they smart? It's the dumbest thing I actually possess. And we have perimeter defences. It's on the back foot. I've lost count of the organisations I've seen who spend an awful lot of money on security when actually don't take care of the BAU stuff. Don't secure perimeters properly, don't do the right thing, but do throw money at technology. It simply doesn't work. It's the ground-up security that really works. Patching, of course, let's not go there. And the skill issues, which do exist in IT security arenas. Okay, and here we have something that's a reality of a DOS attack, an incursion that went on for a long time. And we're talking about nearly 10 years ago now, when this was occurring, every single day from China, an attack would take place against a well-known organisation. Every single day, at the same time, the same size, the same packet. And it was tolerated because it didn't actually affect the service. But the question we need to ask is, if that's happening to your organisation, what is the motivation? What is the objective? And here we have the naval site being taken down. Again, the British Navy said there was no data lost, there was nothing compromised. It's just bloody embarrassing to have something taken offline in the time of conflict. So this is really about a statement about what we can do. And this wasn't down to the Navy, I believe. This was down to those who are hosting the service on behalf of the Navy. So maybe the problem should be shared elsewhere, but very embarrassing. And then we have the trends of threat, and this is where we see trends coming from. I believe this is courtesy of Microsoft, so thank you, Microsoft, for your hard work here, showing the way that crime and trends of developing nasty code are going up and down. And it shows those people like Korea, France, Spain. Korea is a very interesting topic because Korea is very under-technology based and yet has one of the highest technology capabilities to attack, probably in the world. It's an interesting place. Second interesting thing about Korea, North Korea, if you pass over at night time with a satellite, it's completely dark. So the motivation for having high capability to attack is questionable. And then we see the trends where people are really interested in doing special things. Trojans, miscellaneous, up there, China 28%, Germany, worms, adware, password stealers, exploits, backdoors, viruses, all this nice stuff that can be utilised and gained online to be utilised against a target. And what's really interesting is anything is online. James showed you what you can buy in the form of a crime kit. If you want some credit cards, I can give you a great URL where you can go and buy a really nice American Express card for about $20. If you want a really, really super duper one, it's going to cost you a bit more. But hey, let's be fair, nothing's for free. So we have this trend of Spain for worms, Russia with love, their adware, the things that bring something to your computer you really don't want to have there, Trojans, downloaders. And we've seen recently, you've read in the press about the drone in the US being infected with a virus, piece of malware, that actually didn't affect the device working, it simply gathered intelligence. And then we had the report that there's been a satellite hacked, and that's had some form of circumvention taking place, probably at the base station. Now, I come from the strange world of this background, and I would guess that one of those two things has something in common. The drone virus was actually taking down intelligence. And what's interesting is, notwithstanding the fact that there's been a virus identified, the DQ virus, which is a new one, which has been called Son of Stuxnet, nobody's actually attributed the problem to that virus. I believe it is one of the same. I believe this was the virus that infected the drones. And then we have the rogue antivirus stuff. Luckily, this is going away now because people are becoming very wise to the fact that a piece of Trojan malware, like an antivirus program, is fairly obvious. And that actually, thankfully, is on the decline. So we have now back to the cyber war, cyber conflict. It's now considered a reality. Richard A. Clarke, who was ex-US government, wrote a book called CyberWar, which states and sets out a lot of information about what cyber war implications are. I prefer to call it cyber conflict because a war has its own set of protocols. But there are capabilities in nations, there are capabilities in big, small, medium powers. We have something in the form of a cyber warfarean toolkit that really does sit alongside kinetic capabilities. For a fact, I believe cyber war or cyber conflict capabilities are here. In fact, I'd go so far as to say I believe Stuxnet was an example of that very trend. And then we have the stuff that really happens, and this is all amazing stuff. For instance, we have the skip at the bottom is actually where my data ended up when I got a phone call from a journalist saying, Are you Mr. Walker? Did you have a windscreen break on your car? Because here are your credit card details. The company concerned went into liquidation and my credit card details ended up in that skip. Wasn't very happy. The bags of paper are interesting because these are people who are semi-interested in security but not quite there. And if you really look closely, these shreddings, and they have shredded, and one's a major financial institution based in London and one's a solicitor's office, the shreddings are so wide it took me about 30 minutes to actually, because they let me take the bag from outside the shop, but they didn't mind me walking away with the bag of rubbish. I was doing them a favour. It took me 30 minutes to reconstitute 3 personal letters because they had not only been shredded wide, they were sequential. So it's very easy to lay the paper out, sellotape, and read the content. This is not security. And the devices at the bottom was a pile of computers which were just being outed from the organisation that were just left in a loading bay waiting to be picked up. This is all low-hanging stuff. And the printers, these are little devices that we refer to as MFDs, multifunctional devices. They're not printers, they're computers. They have hard drives, they have logic, they contain information, they have IP addresses, they contain information about what they've stored, they have print servers. Many organisations, including some in the world of PCI, forget to secure these assets. So if they're not secured, you're not secure. In fact, one example I'd give, a really good, bad example, is an organisation who spent a significant amount of money to put their systems into a virtualised space so no data existed apart from within the computer room, apart from on the multifunctional devices. And then we come to some research I did earlier this year in response to Shady Rat. And what was interesting about this was, first of all, the amount of companies who deploy Office 2010 and don't consider its security options and vulnerabilities. For instance, one really interesting feature, and if you've got it in your workplaces, go check, send and save. So any employee can press that button, send that data and save it to his or her internet location. They can also post blogs direct from the application, so think about blocking that. We had data leakage. There's a little tool called Fokker. Anyone heard of Fokker here? Any Fokkers in the room? Okay. I Fock regular. And these are actually examples of what was dragged down from sites. And some sites are bleeding information. They're bleeding data about their users, their logons, their directories, freely accessible. Fokker can run against a big site. It takes about half an hour and can drag down so much intelligence. And why bother? Well, it's a little bit about intelligence. If you've got the information, if you've got user IDs, passwords, document locations, you know the devices they're using, the operating systems, their vulnerabilities, their patch levels, it gives you something to think about when you're attacking them. E.g., it saves you time. And then we have the denial of service zone transfer. I did a test on 100 sites, 16 sites allowed zone transfer, which means you can transfer out at leisure their entire structure of how their servers are configured. And then it's a simple case of just working out where the interesting assets lie and simply, in one case, connecting to the asset from a browser, downloading a file which contained hard-coded user IDs and passwords. That simple, from a browser. And then we have probably the worst thing of all on the sheet, and I can talk about this because I won't follow the story through. It's freedom of information that made available a report that was releasable, which highlighted MI5 and MI6 some years ago. The interesting thing about the report was it didn't take account of those people it could implicate in the report. So when this report went onto the internet, it exposed a number of people, real-life scenarios, who placed danger at the doorstep of locations identified in said report. It was reported, and I believe it was removed. But the point is, freedom of information should not just consider the document that's been released. It should consider the implications, what's implicit inside the content. That is really important. And then we have the threats. So here right now we have Trojan horses. It's been identified in the US that they say quite happily that they are aware some points of their systems of control, utilities, may have Trojans. We have components in the wild that possibly, where we have people developing code, haven't considered OWASP and what they need to do about securing code. We have a case of does closed source equal potentials for insecurity or security? The jury's out. Consider Cisco routers, the amount of Cisco routers that have been released into the wild, which aren't Cisco routers, but actually look like Cisco routers, act like Cisco routers, but are actually Trojans. And then we have the new chipsets with their advanced technology, which allows you to possibly manipulate the machine to such a higher level than you could before, where the user can still operate while you're still working below their operations. And the next generation of how to secure cloud. Cloud. What were you supposed to do with cloud? Ooh, cloud. Cloud is bad. Cloud is horrible. Cloud will never work. Get real. We're going to have cloud. Why? It's an economic implication. Cloud will save money. There is an organization called TPAT, which is Third Party Assurance Center, who are seeking to give you some validation of what cloud really means. So you can go and look at a cloud provider, because no two cloud providers are the same, and understand what they have to give you in the way of services and support. And in the form of cloud, we also have, and we've seen it already, and James mentioned it today, we have cloud offering crimeware as a service. It's out there today. I know cloud providers who will give you this service. In fact, the worst example, which I blogged about on InfoSec, was last week an online provider was found to be hosting some servers called Lolita, and for anybody involved in paedophilia, in a good sense, they'll know what Lolita means. And these servers were hosting over 100 gigabytes of child abuse images, not child pornography, child abuse images. They were online, ready for the taking. And that's not just a rarity. There are sites all over the world. These things need to be dealt with. And as for the mice, it's the clicking. We have a lot of people out there gnawing at the cheese, clicking at that mouse and causing themselves and other people problems. And we need to get to grips with that. We need to get this message out to the wider public to stop the mice from clicking those machines. And with that, I thank you for your time.